What if May 8th, 1945 never brought a surrender? What if instead of victory fireworks, a different flag flew over Moscow, London, and Washington? Millions of people would never have known what freedom was. And those who survived would have forgotten forever what it smells like. Stay until the end, because this story will change the way you see our world. 1946, Berlin is celebrating. Adolf Hitler stands at the podium of the new Reichstag, a massive building with a dome of pure glass, designed by architect Albert Speer. The crowd roars. Kamerasroll. Radio broadcasts across all of Europe. An orchestra plays an anthem that just a few years ago seemed like the ravings of a fanatic, and now rings out like a law of nature. But behind this picture of triumph, millions of empty houses, burned cities, and silence where life once existed. A silence that screams louder than any orchestra. Welcome to a world that never was. And that, God willing, never will be. To understand how all of this could have happened, we need to go back a few years. In our reality, Hitler made a fatal mistake. He attacked the Soviet Union in winter, underestimating the vast distances, the frost, and the tenacity of the Soviet soldier. But in this alternative history, he made a different choice. In the autumn of 1941, when his generals were already preparing for the assault on Moscow, Hitler stopped. Not out of mercy, out of cold calculation. He pulled his armies back to winter positions, regrouped his forces, secured his supply lines. Soviet intelligence reported to Stalin, "The enemy is retreating." Stalin relaxed. It was a trap. In the spring of 1942, the Wehrmacht struck with a force this war had never seen before. 3 army groups, simultaneously, coordinated, relentless. Soviet defenses cracked apart. Kharkiv, Stalingrad, Kiev, all fell within weeks. By August, the front line had pushed beyond the Volga. In October, Moscow fell. Stalin fled beyond the Urals. The radio still broadcast his speeches for a few days, recorded in advance to prevent panic. But people already knew. The city knew. The country knew. The Soviet Union did not officially surrender. It simply collapsed like an old bridge under too much weight. One by one, the republics slipped out of Moscow's control. Part of the army kept fighting, in forests and steppes, in the mountains of the Caucasus. But a centralized front no longer existed. In the West, meanwhile, something else was unfolding. Britain, exhausted by 3 years of relentless bombing and naval blockade, was barely holding on. Churchill spoke in Parliament about fighting to the last, but behind closed doors, his ministers were already conducting secret negotiations. When it became clear that the USSR was broken and that the United States showed no urgency to enter the war, the decision made itself. In February 1943, Britain signed a separate peace. Not a surrender, technically a peace. But the terms were such that the difference became irrelevant. British colonies in Africa passed to joint control. The fleet was disarmed. Churchill resigned the following day. He said nothing publicly. He simply disappeared from public life and never returned. America found itself alone. Roosevelt wanted to fight. He knew that something terrible was being built across the Atlantic, and that sooner or later it would reach American shores. But Congress withheld its consent. Isolationists shouted, "This is not our war." People did not want to send their sons to die in Europe again. After the First World War, that wound had not yet healed. The United States stopped at the Atlantic. They supplied what they could, but there was no longer anyone left to supply on the front. The Reich celebrated. Japan, Hitler's ally, celebrated alongside him and continued its own war across Asia and the Pacific. The globe was divided, and no people were asked whether they agreed. Germania, the official new name for the rebuilt Berlin, became the largest city on the planet. Speer had been building it for years with maniacal precision. Wide boulevards along which you could march in columns 100 men across. Monumental triumphal arches before which Napoleon's Arc de Triomphe would have looked like a toy. A gigantic dome, the People's Hall, capable of holding 180,000 people, and so vast that clouds formed inside it from the breath of the crowd. A city built for parades, not for people. The ordinary Berliner looked at all of this with pride, because that was what he had been taught. But he also knew, in this city, it was better not to say anything unnecessary, even at home, even to your wife, because walls have ears, and the neighbor you lent a tool to the day before yesterday might very well turn out to be an informant. Occupied peoples existed within a strict hierarchy, spelled out in the Reich's secret directives. The French and the Dutch, close by racial theory, held the status of auxiliaries. They could work, trade, even serve in the army in secondary roles. Their languages remained, for now. Their churches, for now. Their traditions, for now. But every for now lasted exactly as long as it suited Berlin. Slavs, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians found themselves in an entirely different position. Under mention, the word was no longer just propaganda. It had become a legal term, a legal status, a reality. Their cities were renamed. Krakow became Krakow, Kiev became Kiev, Kharkiv became Charkow. Streets, squares, rivers, everything received new names, as if the old ones might remind someone that other people had once lived here. Their languages were banned in schools. Children were taught exclusively in German. And within a generation, people were meant to grow up who would not know the words their grandmothers spoke. That was the goal, not to kill a language, to let it die quietly, along with those who remembered it. The land was settled by German colonists. Young couples from Bavaria, Saxony, Austria received plots in the east, with a house, equipment, and often with people who until yesterday had called that house their own. Those people were displaced. Where was never officially specified. There were no Jews left in Europe. Not one. That sentence is short, but behind it lies an abyss of horror that no text can convey. 6 million. In our reality, that number was already incomprehensible even after the Allied victory. In this alternative world, it was simply never spoken aloud. Archives were hidden, documents destroyed. The Reich tried to make the crime invisible. But crimes of this scale cannot be hidden. They seep through the silence, through absence, through children's questions that parents cannot answer. For the ordinary German, at least at first, it genuinely looked like a golden age. Unemployment vanished. Shops were full, because the resources of occupied countries flowed into the Reich in an endless stream. Meat, which just 10 years earlier had been a luxury, became commonplace. New apartments were being built in conquered Poland, and there was no shortage of people willing to move. Vacations on the French Riviera became a mass phenomenon. Propaganda showed happy faces, wide beaches, sunshine. This is what victory gives you, the posters said. And people believed it, or pretended to believe, which, in the end, amounts to the same thing. But prosperity had a price, and not only the price paid by the conquered peoples. The Gestapo did not shrink after victory, it grew. A network of informants covered every neighborhood, every workplace, every school. Reporting a neighbor for anti-Reich statements was not a crime. It was a duty. Those who stayed silent when they heard something suspicious became suspicious themselves. Art existed, but only of one kind. Paintings depicted sturdy Aryans against golden fields or victorious battles. Sculptures, ideal body symbolize racial perfection. Music, marches and anthems. Cinema, heroic soldiers and self-sacrificing mothers. Jazz, atonal music, abstract painting, all of it was degenerate art. Keeping such things at home could make you disappear. And people disappeared, quietly, without trial or investigation. Today, a person existed. Tomorrow, they did not. Neighbors did not ask. Colleagues at work pretended not to notice. Families stayed silent, because asking questions could also become a reason to disappear. Thinking was dangerous. Speaking, even more so. The Reich poured enormous resources into science and technology, but not for human benefit. The rocket program, led by Wernher von Braun, in our world, eventually put a man on the moon. In this alternative, it remained a weapon. Ballistic missiles could reach the American coastline. That was enough to keep Washington in a state of permanent fear. The atomic project moved more slowly than in the United States, but in 1949, the Reich finally had a bomb. The test was conducted in the Sahara on occupied African soil. Photographs of a mushroom cloud were never published. They simply made it understood to the Americans that it existed. The hint was enough. Between the two superpowers, the Reich and the United States, a cold equilibrium settled in. Neither wanted open war. Both knew what it would cost them both. So they competed differently in technology, in propaganda, in covert operations. Spies from both sides swarmed each other's capitals. Radio stations were jammed. Letters were intercepted. Japan held Asia. Together with the Reich, they had signed a pact dividing the world into spheres of influence. And as long as both sides held to it, the world remained in a strange, fragile, suffocating balance. Africa became one vast colony. The Middle East, a Reich protectorate. Oil flowed in one direction. Money, too. And in basements, mountains, and forests, resistance burned. Polish partisans in the Mazovian forests. Ukrainian units in the Carpathians. The French underground in Paris, passing information through a system of coded words hidden in ordinary letters. Jewish families who had managed to survive, hiding for decades, changing names, documents, faces. Small, brutal, often hopeless, but alive, because people can be conquered, but memory cannot. 20 years passed. 30. Hitler was aging, and his regime aged with him. Anyone who builds power on a personality cult always forgets one thing. Personalities are mortal. By the late 1960s, Hitler barely appeared in public. The trembling of his hands was hidden from cameras. Speeches were recorded in advance and edited so that no one could tell how many takes had been needed. Inside the party, a quiet struggle for succession had been underway for years, brutal, poisoned, invisible to the outside world. He died in April 1968. The official announcement spoke of natural death following illness. 3 days of mourning, torch processions, speeches about the immortal spirit, and then disputes over who would stand at the helm next. Disputes that could have become open civil war within the Reich. But the most interesting thing did not begin among the generals and officials. It began from below. Young Germans, grandchildren of those who had built this regime, began asking questions. Not loudly, at first. Only at home, in whispers, when no strangers were present. Why are entire peoples absent from our textbooks? Where did all the Jews go? Every single one of them, across all of Europe. Why does grandmother sometimes whisper words in some strange language and go silent when someone enters the room? Why does grandfather cry when he hears a certain melody and refuses to explain what the melody is or where it comes from? Cracks in the monuments. The truth did not shout. It seeped through old letters found in an attic, through photographs of people no one could identify, through words that grandmothers spoke in their sleep, Polish words, Yiddish words, Ukrainian words, languages they had never taught their grandchildren, but which they themselves could not forget. And perhaps, just perhaps, even in this suffocating alternative world, its own moment would have come. Its own 1989. Not necessarily a wall. Perhaps just a square somewhere where one person spoke the truth out loud, and the crowd did not disperse. Because systems built on lies share one common flaw. They require everyone to stay silent simultaneously. Always, without exception, forever. And people cannot stay silent forever. Human dignity always returns. Through generations, through decades of silence, through mountains of ash and tons of lies, it returns. Always. This is the answer to the question this story has been asking from the very beginning. Why didn't Germany win? Not only because the Allies were stronger, but because a system built on the destruction of human dignity is doomed. Sooner or later, one way or another, our world emerged from that war broken, but free. And that is not an accident. It is the result of choices made by millions of people who decided there are things worth dying for, because without them, there is nothing worth living for. This story is fiction, but the lessons it carries are real. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Alternative histories that make you think and won't let you go until the very end. And write in the comments, What do you think saved our world from this scenario? One moment, one decision, one person. What changed everything?